This week's case is about the biggest heist in Canadian history. But it wasn't money or drugs. It was maple syrup stolen. So, let's get started. Hello everyone, my name is Brandy, and it is time for a true crime case, mystery, or paranormal story with one or more of my fabulous felines. If you are a returning subscriber, welcome back, my feline friends, and a big shout out to my feline fans for helping support this channel. Just a quick merch update. Of course, Black Friday is just around the corner, and right now there is a holiday sale going on in the merch shop. It's $15 tees and everything else is on sale. Now, starting for Black Friday, everything is on sale and the tees are only $12.50. And that goes through Cyber Monday. So if you want to pick up one of the 4 designs that I have in the merch shop, I would do it during Black Friday. So why would someone want to steal maple syrup of all things? Well, at the time that this happened, a barrel of maple syrup was more expensive than a barrel of crude oil. So it's understandable why someone would target this product. Now, to understand why or how this happened, we first have to start off with understanding the maple syrup industry in Quebec, Canada. I'm talking world here, the world's maple syrup is mostly made in Quebec, Canada. About 70% of it comes from Quebec. So yeah, this is an entire world here, okay? Now, maple syrup is so important in Quebec that there are grades of maple syrup that created and recommendations on how to use each grade effectively. The more golden the color a syrup is, the more it's considered the high quality, the best. And then the darker it gets as the season moves along, the less desirable it is. Now, if you were to sit down at a table in Quebec and you were to serve your guests a dark commercial type syrup, they would consider it an insult. So don't take your Mrs. Butterworth to Canada. You will be ran out of the country. Maple syrup is a seasonal harvest, and it requires optimal conditions to be a good crop. The sap of a maple tree is collected using taps inserted to the trunk of a tree or tubing. The sap is then transformed into syrup through a process of evaporation. And the maple syrup is considered a natural product. It's not processed, and therefore it can be easily stored for a long time without losing its flavor or going bad. Now, all the maple syrup that is harvested from the farmers in Quebec is actually controlled by the Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers, also known as the FPAQ. Now, the FPAQ is a government-sanctioned private organization that regulates the production and marketing of maple syrup in Quebec. The FPAQ was created in 1966, but they went to what they call a joint plan in 1989 in order to help protect the almost 10,000 farmers. Now, the syrup market can fluctuate a lot, due to various things, especially climate, right? It has to be optimal climate conditions. So trying to determine what the demand for the syrup can be each year can be difficult. Now, if the weather isn't just right or the trees don't produce enough sap, if there's a recession, usually consumers will, that's the first thing they kind of cut off of their grocery bill, because even though syrup's important, it's not an essential item for most people, right? So the FPAQ was created to taken all the syrup from the farmers into their organization. Then they will negotiate prices with authorized buyers. Not everyone just can buy from the FPAQ. They have about 8 authorized buyers. Any syrup that they can't sell to an authorized buyer, they'll put in reserves, and they'll draw down those reserves later if there's a year where harvesting is a little lean due to climate conditions. Now, the entire goal of doing this is to help stabilize the prices of syrup so it's not, going on a roller coaster. So the farmers that do this would have steady incomes and can count on that income from year to year, even if the harvesting is a little lean. Well, this sounds pretty good, right? A company comes in and instead of going through like this with revenue, it is now steady and you can expect a steady income. Because of the way that the FPAQ is ran, some people have compared it to like a cartel. A cartel is an associate of members or manufacturers with the purpose of maintaining high prices at the highest level possible and restricting competition. So cartels, aren't usually looked at as a great thing. So some farmers have complained that the FPAQ has too strict of rules in place. I mean, they make the farmers show them like their revenue earnings, their bank accounts, their business, earnings and all that stuff, revenue statements. And some have complained that they even gone so far to get into their personal business, like asking how much they pay in alimony or child support, which has nothing really to do with the maple syrup business. So why would they be asking stuff like that? There's also an issue that if some farmers don't agree how the FPAQ is conducting business, whether it's price negotiations, authorized buyers, reserve storage issues, quotas. Oh yes, the FPAQ gives these farmer quotas every year as well. If they have a problem with any of these things, they really have little say or actually no control at all. They just have to follow the guidelines per the law. So the FPAQ board actually approves like a joint plan. Once that joint plan is approved, all farmers in Quebec must follow that plan whether they like it or not. Some farmers want to see the FPAQ gone because these farmers do not want to be controlled or told what they can and can't do with the syrup that they're harvesting. But it is illegal to operate outside the rules of the FPAQ per the Canadian government. Even if a farmer was to transport their syrup outside of Quebec or even outside of Canada and sell it, it's illegal to do. All syrup harvested in Quebec must go through the FPAQ, and there are no exceptions. This is such an ongoing issue in Quebec with kind of the fighting back and forth that they actually have attorneys that specialize in maple syrup litigation. There are actually job titles where you can open a phone book and find maple syrup attorney. Now, due to all of this, a maple syrup black market had been created. It's just weird to say, a maple syrup black market. And it started with the farmers that were not happy with dealing with the FPAQ. The farmers would have, a contact, which were dubbed barrel rollers because maple syrups are stored in barrels. And they would work with that contact to move the syrup from their location outside of the FPAQ guidelines and sell it on the black market to the highest bidder usually. But this is done also at very great risk. If a farmer is caught stealing syrup to the black market, they are looking at jail time and very heavy fines. And by the way, those fines that get put on farmers, those fines go directly to the FPAQ. And then if you are caught doing this, that gives the permission for the FPAQ to actually come into your business and seize your syrup and not pay you for it. So you can see why the FPAQ has this reputation. Now, to be fair, there are farmers that are completely okay with the FPAQ. They appreciate them coming in and stabilizing prices, and they fully support all and everything the FPAQ does. There is a split down the middle. It's pretty much 50-50. Now, let's jump to the spring of 2011. That year was a great year for the syrup farmers. The climate was perfect, and there was so much syrup that was harvested from these trees, the FPAQ had a bunch to put in reserves because they couldn't sell it all to their authorized buyers. Now, they had so much syrup in reserves, they had to open an extra warehouse to store this syrup because their other warehouses were full. So the warehouse that they found to store this reserve syrup was in an industrial park next to a busy highway where other businesses could actually rent out warehouse space in the same kind of industrial park. The surplus was stored in these white barrels, and each white barrel or drum contained 54 gallons of syrup. And there were 16,000 of these drums that were stored in this new warehouse. Now, every warehouse where the reserves are stored are actually inspected by the FPAQ at least twice a year. At this new warehouse, there was actually little security. They had like alarms, but they weren't like high-tech alarms. There were no cameras. There were security guards, but they were kind of not there 24/7. And really, who would have thought that their maple syrup was going to get stolen, right? Well, let me introduce you to Richard Valerez and Avik Caron. Now, Avik's wife partially owned this industrial park / warehouse where this syrup was being stored. And he got this idea of, hey, we could steal these barrels and sell it on the black market. Now, Avik obviously at this point already had a criminal record for some theft, some grand theft auto. And, why stop now, right? Let's look at the big score. So Avik got in touch with Richard Valerez. Richard was a black market contact. He was a barrel roller. So now, Avik and Richard working together, they could sell these barrels to the black market. So they developed a plan, and they needed a few more key players to make this work. Now, Richard's father, Raymond Valerez, he was a maple syrup farmer in Quebec, and the family had always had a grudge against the FPAQ, and they always operated outside the rules and sold to the black market, hence why Richard got into it as a barrel roller. So Raymond was automatically pulled in because of that. The men also needed, besides the black market, they wanted other places to sell their syrup, hence why Raymond was brought in. But they also brought in another man, and his name was Etienne Saint-Pierre. Now, he was an out-of-province syrup reseller. He wasn't a farmer. He just would buy syrup and resell it. But he wasn't out of Quebec. He actually did his business in New Brunswick. Because Etienne was operating outside of Quebec, he was not required to follow the rules of the FPAQ. But Quebec farmers were not allowed to sell directly to resellers or buyers. They had to sell their syrup to the FPAQ, and then the FPAQ would sell the syrup to the authorized buyers. Etienne was interested in this whole scheme because in New Brunswick, there is only 212 syrup farmers compared to almost 7,000 in Quebec. So you can see, the shift of product here. So, if he's getting more syrup out of Quebec, the more he can resell and the more money he can make. And then finally, they had hired a truck driver named Sébastien Juteras. I hope I'm saying that right. He was the transporter for the syrup. He was going to drive the syrup back and forth to the various locations. Now, these 5 men were the 5 main players in this heist, but there were several other people that were a part of this to make it work. Now, here was the plan. Get access to the warehouse. Well, that was actually simple enough because Avik's wife owned part of the warehouse, right? So he just simply rented the next door warehouse to where the syrup was being stored. And then he just kind of threw some family stuff in the warehouse that required forklifts to move. So, no one would think it was unusual if he had a forklift and was going in and out of the warehouse area or the industrial park as a whole. Nobody really asked any questions. So every day they would go to the warehouse. They would break into the syrup warehouse portion and they would take out a couple barrels a day. They would put them on a truck and they would take the barrels to another location. At that location, they would actually empty the FPAQ syrup barrels into another barrel that they had. And then they would fill the FPAQ barrel with water and return it to the warehouse. So when the place was inspected twice a year like it was supposed to be, the inspectors were none the wiser because nobody's actually popping open the lid to the barrel to look. They're just making sure it's their barrels with their stickers. After the men got a hold of the syrup in their own barrels, they would then transport barrels of syrup out of Quebec. So it was out from under the watchful eye of the FPAQ. And then the syrup was sold on the black market that went anywhere to the United States and even to Europe. And then Etienne St. Pierre would rebrand the syrup that he was getting as his own New Brunswick syrup and then would sell to his buyers. So they continued doing this every day for a year. And it was all running smooth. Money was rolling in hand over fist, and the FPAQ was none the wiser. So all was going well until July of 2012. So in July of 2012, the warehouse was due for an inspection, and one of the FPAQ inspectors arrived at the warehouse and started inspecting. Well, there were so many barrels. Sometimes, inspectors have to crawl over and climb on top of barrels and everything. And he was doing just that when one of the barrels he climbed on top of almost toppled over. Now, a full barrel of syrup, 54 gallons, would weigh somewhere around 600 pounds. So for an average guy to climb on top of a barrel and it almost topple over, something was amiss. So the inspector pulled the lid off of that barrel and discovered it was actually completely empty. Apparently, after, stealing these barrels and doing their thing for a year, these 5 guys got really lazy. They stopped filling the FPAQ barrels with water and would just return them to the warehouse empty. So the inspector started, kind of kicking barrels around the area, and he started finding a lot of empty barrels. Then as he was looking closer, he noticed that some of the barrels had rust on them. Now, maple syrup does not sweat or does not create condensation, even when it's cold out. So finding rust on a white syrup barrel is a concern. So they started open up these rusted barrels and they were finding that they were full of water. The whole heist operation had been discovered and a massive investigation began. They brought in all the inspectors from FPAQ and they actually went around and opened every single barrel in that warehouse. And in the end, they found that 9,751 syrup barrels were stolen. These barrels were valued at over $2,000 per barrel at the time. So in total, almost $19 million of syrup had been stolen out of this warehouse. This was the biggest heist in Quebec history. Now, the way they figured out who was responsible for this heist was pretty interesting. So the FPAQ has these special forklifts for moving their barrels and transporting them. And this is because most of the barrels are this white, pristine color, and you don't want to, scratch or dent or anything in the barrels because they will rust because the paint will be rubbed off. So let's say that this is a barrel of syrup. The forklift would actually come in and they would clip the top lip, clip the bottom lip, and then this is how the barrels were transported. It wasn't a regular forklift to avoid that scratching and scuffing of the barrels. The barrels that they found were stolen or tampered with, filled with water, actually had scratch marks and dents all over them, meaning that a special FPAQ forklift was not used to move them, that it was a regular forklift, and that's how the barrels got all scuffed and scratched. So what the investigators did is they went around and checked all of the companies that rented space in this industrial park, and they looked for forklifts that have evidence of like white paint on them where they scuffed the barrel, or any evidence that they were moving syrup barrels and not their regular stuff. They also would check around with rental companies that rented forklifts. Well, they did come across a forklift and it had evidence that it was moving syrup barrels and not their regular stuff. So when they pulled the rental receipt from that forklift, they found one of the names of the 5 guys. And then it just unraveled from there. The investigation led to over 200 people being interviewed and interrogated. And in the end, there were 26 people arrested, including the 5 main players. The Crown prosecutor at the time had stated that this heist was no less serious because it was not cocaine or gold bricks or money, but it was still an economic crime, and that really it was hurting the farmers who worked the fields by the sweat of their brow. Now, some of the public, kind of laughed this off and saw it more as a screw job to the FPAQ. Some people don't like monopolies, right? So that's pretty much what the FPAQ is. It's a state-sanctioned monopoly on maple syrup. So the public was split on how they felt about this heist. Now, after all of the criminal trials were completed, Avik Karan would get 6 years in prison and was fined $1.7 million. Richard Valerez got 8 years in prison and he was fined $9.4 million. And he was labeled as the mastermind in this whole thing. Richard would tell authorities that he only bought and sold the syrup on the black market because him and his family were being threatened by Avik and his gang. But nobody fell for it. Richard was also given 10 years to pay his fine of $9.4 million, and if he fails to pay it within those 10 years, he'll be sentenced to an additional 6 years in prison. Now, Raymond Valerez, Richard's father, he was charged with possession of stolen goods, and he got 2 years in prison and 3 years probation. Etienne St. Pierre was found guilty of theft and fraud because he was rebranding the syrup as his own to resell, and he was sentenced to 2 years home confinement and a 3-year probationary period, and he was fined $1 million also. Now, Etienne has been very critical of the FPAQ because that's why he was in New Brunswick, is to avoid operating under the FPAQ guidelines. He stated that you can't prove that I stole anything. You can't prove that it came out of this tree or this tree or this tree. Once he was found guilty, he then stated, you cannot steal what has already been stolen, referring to the FPAQ stealing from the Quebec farmers. He also stated the FPAQ came down hard on him because he was competition outside of their jurisdiction, and that allowed them to seize all of his syrup and pretty much bankrupt him. So he was no longer competition. Finally, the truck driver, Sebastien Jutrez, served 8 months for his role, But he swears that he had no idea the syrup was stolen. He was just doing his job by transporting it. However, Sebastian was the one that testified against the rest of the clan, so I think he knew more than he was admitting to. Now, after this whole heist had, calmed down, everybody was sentenced and doing their time, the FPAQ got a lot of negative attention, and the Quebec's Minister of Agriculture commissioned a report of their operations rules and guidelines. After the report came out, the FPAQ was told to scrap their quotas for the farmers because they were a bit steep, and they needed to also relax some of their regulations. Now, this wasn't something that they had to do per a court order or a government sanction. It was just a recommendation. So whether they chose to change or update their rules or regulations, that's not exactly known, as everybody's being a little tight-lipped nowadays. In the end, authorities were able to track down and confiscate at least 2/3 of the stolen syrup, but the rest had already made it to the black market and sold to buyers who did not know where the syrup came from, so none of the buyers were held liable for purchasing the syrup. One of the farmers who had fought against the FPAQ for some time, years, had said, they have decriminalized drugs in Quebec, but maple syrup is criminalized. I can see where she comes up with that. Now, it is stated that most of the syrup farmers that do this, they harvest on a part-time basis or kind of as a side hustle, and they usually have other main jobs. Okay. Now, some farmers state that the reason they have to do that is because it's impossible to make a living from just harvesting maple syrup full time because of the prices that were controlled by the FPAQ. However, there are farmers that say because of the FPAQ, they can farm syrup full time because it's profitable for them now, when it apparently wasn't before the FPAQ got involved. So basically, the farmers not doing well, they brought up so that they were profitable. The farmers that were doing great up here, they brought down. So now everybody is on a level playing field. So depending on where you are at, this could be a good thing or a bad thing. So what do you think about this story, and what do you think about the FPAQ? Do you think that there are any industries here in the US that need something like that? Please let me know in the comments down below, and thank you for tuning in. I hope everybody has a great Thanksgiving. I will be back a week after Thanksgiving, and I will see you then with a new video. Thank you for tuning in. Bye, guys.